I am Brujo Benavides, originally from Argentina, currently living in Catalonia. I'm an Erlang developer for many years and also a trainer. I work at Baxter now, and I also a member of the education working group at the Erlang Ecosystem Foundation.
Hi, my name is Andrea, and I'm a member of the Elixir team, and I'm also a principal engineer at a company called Vips.
My name is Dominic Letz. I'm running the Berlin meetup for Elixir, and I've been involved with Elixir and Erlang for quite some time.
I'm Lars Wikman, probably more known as Underjord or Underjord, as the Americans say. I've been doing Elixir for, about 6 years now. I run a small consultancy, and I'm also one of the hosts of Beam Radio.
Hi, I'm Michal Muskala, and I work with Erlang at WhatsApp.
I'm Peter Ullrich. I'm a Elixir backend developer and educator. I've got a blog at peterullrich.com. I've been working with Elixir now for 5 years and been quite active in the Elixir community.
Hi, I'm Saša, and I'm an Elixir developer and author of a book, Elixir in Action.
My name is Toby. People might know me from various things in the Elixir and the Beam community, from being the creator of Benchy, the best benchmarking library out there, not just on the Beam, but also other places. This conference is happening in my hometown, and I run the Ruby user group here. I also maintain Simplecoff, the Ruby coverage library. Most recently, I was a senior staff engineer at remote.com, but not anymore, so I'm also looking for a job, but I think that's about me. My favorite color is green. I like punk rock music. Hello.
Hi, I'm Wojtek Mach. I'm based in Krakow, Poland, and I'm a developer at Dashbit.
Hi, I am José Valim, and I'm the creator of the Elixir programming language.
I started with PHP and then found Ruby. And then I knew of José Valim. He was a prominent figure in Ruby. So I kind of saw what he was up to. So I saw Elixir that way.
I started with the Beam 20 years after I wrote my first Hello World. It was admittedly 10 years after I started working as a full-time professional. So I did C, C++, C#, Ruby, and of course JavaScript. Those would be like the main languages that I used to work with a lot.
I'm going to be able to recall all programming languages, but at the time was mostly a Ruby developer. And I've started playing with concurrency, which eventually brought me here.
In my professional career, it was pretty much just sort of like I started out with Ruby. I got to know Ruby way in university. So I already started running the local Ruby user group while I was still a student, and did a bunch of open source shoes and whatnot, but I also did Smalltalk. I did Smalltalk before I did Ruby, which not many people can say of themselves. Then Java and all the other stuff. But then I was in Ruby. And then, that was it.
Well, at university, I used C++, Java, obviously, C2. I used PHP and Python. So before using Elixir, my main language was Python, but I also have done some work in PHP and some in Node.js.
I think mostly before was PHP, Ruby, some JavaScript, that kind of stuff.
So my absolute first attempt was C++, and I learned the basics of programming in C++ from a book. And then I got really pissed because it never taught me how to make a button. So then I stopped doing C++. It started going off about like classes and objects. Didn't really care about that. Turned out the object was not a button you could click. So what's the point? Instead, I ended up doing HTML for a bit, and there you could make buttons, so I was happy. And then I ended up doing a bunch of web dev. So I went Perl, PHP, got a little bit sick of PHP, picked up JavaScript along the way, but then I went to Python, and I was doing Python up until I found Elixir. I've also poked around with like .NET and whatever has been required along the way, but mainly like PHP, Python, and then Elixir.
I started when I was very young with QBasic, and then I switched to Visual Basic, C#, and then I learned Smalltalk and Haskell at the university, and then I switched to Erlang.
Only had professional experience with Ruby before starting with Elixir, doing web stuff, but I had, played around with Python, with Haskell and JavaScript and PHP for WordPress stuff, and a little bit of C in university. Ruby was, I think, the main contact point, because the Ruby community at the time was getting a lot of interest into Elixir, so that's where I came from.
I did learn initially on QBasic and then did C++. Did C++ for like a long time. Worked for Nokia for some time, where I learned really a lot about doing distributed systems also with C++. Tons of servers, tons of end devices, all C++. And then it's when I moved on from there and ran into a company that did Erlang. And so really it was from C++ going to Erlang. did that for quite some time, did IoT devices. And that's also at the time I was in Taiwan, when I ran into Elixir for the first time, because Elixir really, in comparison to Erlang, had suddenly these communities pop up. And even in Taiwan, there was suddenly a very lively Elixir community, but there was never before like an Erlang community. And so really the drag was really strong. I'm one of the Erlang converts. I think the community is very much divided. That was my perception. In like Ruby converts, people who have done a lot of Ruby before and then came to Elixir. And Erlang converts, people who have done Erlang and then came to Elixir. And of course, just complete newcomers.
What brought me to Elixir was actually the Erlang virtual machine. Back when I started this, like concurrency was starting to become a really big topic. And I wanted to find like a good programming language, a good platform that can solve the concurrency issues well. And eventually I found the Erlang virtual machine. I fell in love with it and I was like, okay, whatever system, whatever software that I write, I want to use this virtual machine for. I think it's great not only for concurrency, but also distribution, fault tolerance, all those things that the Erlang virtual machine is known for. And I was like, yeah, that's what I want to use. And that's what I have been doing for, 12, 13 years.
I think the big prompt that brought me to the Beam. So I was introduced to it by my CTO at the time, who was kind of excited about it. He had spent a lot of time in the Ruby community, and then he had started poking at Elixir and found it really interesting, found the story of Erlang very interesting. So he talked a big game about it. And I ended up starting to look into it and trying it. But the thing that probably convinced me to really go for it was the fact that we were dealing with a very unstable and very messy Python microservices architecture at the time. Python is really bad at doing multiple things at the same time. Elixir is supposedly very good at it. Turns out that's true. That worked out. And I really enjoyed like the clarity of just working with Phoenix, and like so much of the work I was doing would have been so much simpler with just a straight up Phoenix app. It would have been ridiculous. So that was where I was at the time when like Elixir showed up, and it was just a good match. But it also, I think a lot of what appeals with like Elixir and Phoenix to me is that it is a builder's ecosystem. Like the people that came from Ruby on Rails, they are very focused on like building products and SaaS and stuff. And that shows up in Phoenix. It's for building things. There's not a lot of like theory. There's not a lot of ceremony. It's just like get stuff done. And that's kind of what I like to do. So it's been a sweet, sweet deal for me.
It's very accidental, but basically back in university, I wanted to do Google Summer of Code, and I saw some projects for Elixir. I applied, got accepted, started doing that, working on some Ecto things, and then just stayed. And yeah, then I got opportunity to work with Erlang and WhatsApp, and I've been doing that for the last couple of years.
Ruby, especially back in the day, was terrible at parallelism. You could do some concurrency with some threads and whatnot, but it was just not modern enough in that sense. And so I was already always looking at other languages that could do that. I looked a bit in Crystal, which is sort of like a, let's say it's a bit like a compiled Ruby, but it's not quite Ruby, but they also didn't have parallelism. And then, Elixir came along, and it was done by José Valim, whom I know and appreciated a lot from the Ruby community, because like his old company, Plataformatech, they had lots of like really big, important open source projects, chief among them Device. He knew what it took to build good web applications. I knew he just wasn't like some guy that thought of a program language, but he had a use case for it. And then the time when I really switched and learned it was where the problem at work. We wanted to do live tracking of our couriers because I was working at the same day delivery company. And just Ruby is not a good use case for that. The Ruby language platform, especially at the time when we talked about C Ruby, the main Ruby implementation, just isn't really built for that. And so we're looking for something else. And then was like, okay, Elixir, we have the Erlang processes that has built-in WebSocket support. And so we built a little, I like to call them macro applications of Elixir, and it just worked like a dream. We could never see even like the performance consumption of that, no matter what we did to it. And so that was really fun. And so that's how I came and then also stayed around here.
When I got my first job, I was officially hired as a Python backend developer, but from the very first day, I wrote Elixir. So since 5 years now, I've been stuck with Elixir, and I'm very happy with that relationship. And what I can say about Elixir is just that it works really well for what I do on a daily basis. I work with web applications mostly. And what I love about it is the functional feature, like the functional programming language, because it works really well with how I think about web applications and how about people and users and stakeholders think about web application, which is you think in procedures and use cases, so to say. So when you think, well, if a user clicks a button, you think about what should happen, right? You think, I click the button and then this happens and eventually I have this data in the database. And that just works really well with Elixir, but any functional programming language, because you always have to return something. Everything is very easily readable from top to bottom. Basically, you can follow the whole process. And actually, one thing I love the most about Elixir and especially the Phoenix framework is how the router is structured. So you can define your endpoints in the router, but then inside of the file, you can very nicely see what happens from top to bottom. So authentication, for example, becomes a no-brainer because, I just add this pipeline and it will always check for these endpoints, whether it works, like whether the user's authenticated or not. And that is something that if you use other frameworks like Django, for example, it is not easy at all because it's like defined somewhere at the top of the object of the class, and then you just hope that it applies to the endpoints, and it's very hard to see which endpoints are protected by it, which ones aren't. So just by having Elixir and the Phoenix framework already, my job becomes 99% more easy.
I started definitely with Elixir, not with the Beam at large, because I didn't know what I was doing really. And Elixir resonated a lot. It got my attention by being a language that was sort of worked like my brain, like it was very easy to write, it was very easy to read and understand for me. The standard library was very nice to use, the syntax was very nice, I really liked the immutability, the macros were really nice to use, so I liked all of these. I liked the ecosystem at the time with Plug, Phoenix, and Ecto. That was about it when I started, and so that's what brought me in all of this. I didn't really know about the Beam and the power of the Beam. It took time to learn that. So
community was probably the biggest drag. The fact that from a company perspective, we could find people who were already knowing the language. Like what we did before with Erlang, every new hire, we would train on Erlang. Like it was given that they have never heard of the language, that they have never used the language, and we would just completely train them. But when we switched to Elixir, also because there was a pool available. There was enthusiasts around with Elixir already, and we could tap into that potential. Even though it was just about to start, it was already so lively. So that was, I think, from a business perspective, really a driver. Like from a technical perspective, I think the build tools were so much more robust. Mix, of course. Before that, you had Rebar or you had Erlang MK. We actually had like a ton of Erlang companies, I think, a completely self-built system, completely custom, based on make files and whatnot. And so having the standard around that, having the standard around the formatter, having the standard around the packaging, those were all really good things for which we converted, I would say.
There were very few Erlang developers in Buenos Aires. A company that was doing telecom business was looking for somebody who knows something about functional programming. I loved Haskell. It was my favorite language at the time, and it's a functional programming language, so I joined. And when they started teaching me the language, I fell in love with it, and I've been doing that ever since.
At some point, I basically took a sabbatical for a few months, kind of trying to figure out what I want to do next. And then I found myself using Elixir for personal projects. But I saw the Hex package manager, and it's an open source project. It's a Phoenix app. So I started looking into the app, and then I found there were some issues, some potential improvements to make. So I started sending PRs, and that's kind of how I got started on the Beam. And then later on, I got a job doing Elixir.
What brought me to the Erlang was we were handling some real-time data, and it was around 2010. And so you had to push this to a bunch of connected users. And when you were thinking about the backend technology, there wasn't much. Ruby was our main thing, and it had an event machine, but also at a very, very early version, didn't really live up to what we needed. And so my CTO at the time was like looking a lot into what was out there. And he told me, take a look at Erlang, it could maybe solve your problem. I read Joe's book, and I'm thinking like, this is like very unusual, very nice, but I don't really understand how it's going to help me. And then I found a series of blog posts. I think it was by Richard Jones, who had these articles about having 1 million users connected on Erlang, on their server. And he had like these sketches of how he implemented this. I basically copy pasted this, and I did a proof of concept prototype, and it exceeded all our expectations. So then we went to implementing this thing in Erlang.
It has some really interesting properties, really unique way of handling things. At the same time, the power of the ecosystem, some of the libraries you have, is also really interesting. I also like that Erlang and then Elixir, compared to other languages, are even in the mainstream part of the community, work closely with the academia, right? Applying some of the research into practice. I find it very interesting. And that's one aspect that keeps me interested and keeps me with the technology.
Elixir gives me everything I need. Even if I want to go into hardware programming, I can use NERSC. So we really spread out into so many different industries that for me, there's no reason to change unless the company that I work for has a different backend or different language already. But then I would also choose, like, do I want to work for the company or could I introduce Elixir there? So I made the personal choice to work with Elixir. Works for me really well. I don't think there's something on the horizon that will replace it for me anytime soon. If I want to go into very performance heavy things, I might reach into Rust, but I didn't have to do that yet. So who knows?
The Beam pretty much has everything or most of the things that I need or that I want. I can build web applications beautifully with it, and I much prefer Phoenix and Active for lots of different reasons over even, vanilla Rails. The ecosystem is a bit smaller than Rails, of course, so, you might miss some libraries, but otherwise, if that's not an issue, I would always prefer to build that on Elixir, and that's like the main things I built. But then even, if I wanted to build embedded systems, I can do that in Elixir. If I wanted to build machine learning systems, I can also now do that in Elixir, at least use that power easily without doing something else. If I wanted to build a big distributed system that is more performance intensive, I can do that in Elixir. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm missing this or I'm missing that, or that would be better if we had it. And then usually a couple of months or a couple of years later, it just is introduced in the Elixir ecosystem. And it's also an amazing community. It's so fun to just be and then run into Michal and all the other folks and just chat with them and see what they're doing. So yeah.
The good news is that I've been working with Elixir for like 10 years. For me, it's the easiest language that I've used when it comes to like writing code that I understand and like very naturally. So I don't really have to go out of my way to make things concurrent or to make things resilient or to have immutability. That's all just very low level features of the Beam. I tried things here and there. I tried to play with Rust for some NIF stuff with the Rustler. I used Python when I was using Spark, but at the end of the day, for bigger projects, I always come back to Elixir and the Beam because I think that's what I'm most comfortable with, especially for the area of things I'm working on. Most of the stuff that I'm doing is around web and like distributed systems and backends, and Elixir really shines at that. So.
Languages are changing, and there's a couple of really new languages, and I'm always tapping a little bit into other languages, and whether it's like writing a NIF or writing a port or just writing another piece of software that we need. We get into contact with Go, for example, we get into contact with Rust. At the company that I'm doing right now, which is called Diode, we do everything in Elixir, but we also have like a Go client, we have like some Rust components, and so we get in touch with that when we have to. For example, like Go is really good if you want to deliver tiny binaries to like end devices. The main benefit I see with Elixir to date, where no other language really gets to, is that the amount of code and effectively engineering time you need to get something done. There's no other language, I feel, where you can get to that low amount of code. And that is because often you have this let it crash from Erlang, really back from Erlang, let it crash, where you write the happy path of your program. And there's all these edge cases that can happen, but they are, because you write assertive with match expressions, they are captured. And VM will take care of them, it will let it crash, and if it actually happens, you're still on the safe side. And that really allows you to write prototypical code very, very quickly. And when you're in a startup or just even in a big corporate and you need to get a project done to a deadline, like it's just super effective to do that with Elixir.
I would say that like the Beam platform, the processes and things like that are still quite unique. And I think other communities are only now catching up. Like Swift added actors. I think in the newest Java have these like millions of kind of processes. And then the Beam had it for like 30 years. So I think the foundation is quite unique still. I think Elixir is extremely pragmatic language. I try to keep up somewhat with what other people are doing, but I don't think they come anywhere close at the moment.
The most tempting thing to move towards has been Rust, but I would go for Rust if I needed what Rust brings to the table, which is kind of the low-level end of things. I've poked around at like recent.NET, not very tempted. Elixir is progressing well. It's doing everything I want it to do. And it's like still exciting. People are still pushing it forward, and I find it really easy to work with. I get a lot of stuff done with it. So I'm not tempted to go anywhere else. Most of what I do is web development. So Phoenix is just very, very good deal for that. Rust, I think, is a very good complement for what like Elixir offers, but because Elixir is so high level, it will never be the ultimate in performance. It does make a bunch of trade-offs, and I think it's mostly making smart trade-offs, and most of the trade-offs it made were made by Erlang way back. But there are times when it's not appropriate, like, oh, you need to do offline first, or you need to do something really tightly embedded, like, yeah, look into Rust or Zig or whatever. Like, Elixir is not for everything. I think it's a mistake to try and think it is, but it is for 95% of what I do. So that's a good fit for me.
I'm a happy user of Beam and the languages, especially Elixir. For me, I focus primarily on the server side of things, on backend system. And I just find that Beam, with its concurrency model, with its support for massive concurrency, fault tolerance, scalability, both directions, stateful systems, that it gives me tools to handle those kind of challenges in ways which are simpler than with other platforms. You can solve these problems with whatever, and I used to solve those problems with other languages, and I was happy with that. But after familiarizing myself with Erlang and seeing like what it can give me, I just don't want to go back to anything else. I just feel like these tools give me the most for my needs.
One of the things that I like about this community is how easy it is to contribute to it. When I was working with .NET or C#, making a contribution that serves a lot of people in the community was really hard. You had to go through Microsoft and whatnot. Maybe that changed. But in this community, as soon as I started working on open source projects here, I got a lot of feedback and positive contributions. And these days, I create mostly plugins for River 3, and I share them with the community. And I always get a lot of contribution and collaboration. And so it's a very inclusive community, I think. I like it a lot.
It's funny because when I started working on Elixir, at the beginning, you start creating a new programming language. You have no idea if it's going to succeed or fail. And I would tell the company who was investing some of my time, I was like, hey, everybody's on the same page. I can work on this for 2-3 years and it may go nowhere. But Elixir has been able to grow the community, industry adoption. And what keeps me going is, I think it's mainly the fact that I'm still learning. We started with Elixir. It was a huge learning process for me. And then I knew Elixir was going to be good for the web. And I was able to contribute in that and learn how it is to create a web framework or create applications in an environment that can be truly concurrent and distributed. And that was a huge learning opportunity. And now going back to more recently, I am learning everything related to machine learning, artificial intelligence. We are researching a type system for Elixir, and it's also have been another big learning curve and journey for me. And so I'm still enjoying it. I'm still learning a lot. And that's what keeps me going and excited, even after, 10, 13 years.
If I were queen for a day, probably merge Elixir and Erlang into one and not have two languages, because I think that can create a little bit of a divide, not among people in the community, but among tooling, for example, right? So there are instances where there is duplicated effort when, building libraries or building tooling for Elixir and Erlang, and some, Erlang has some better tooling for some things and Elixir has better tooling for other things. And I wish they could be just the same. That would be one thing. Types would probably be nice. Typing system that is not intrusive. I think that would work really well. And tooling, probably, when I see languages like Go or JavaScript or Python, they have fantastic tooling for editors, and Elixir is really catching up, especially recently with NextLS and LexicalLS. There's a lot of work happening in language servers in that space, but I would really love to see that work move a lot forward and be top notch, like you can see in other communities and other languages that are just more widely used probably, but that would be awesome.
My mind is around the things I work on, of course. I've been working on this project called Elixir Desktop that allows you to bring Elixir applications actually to desktop applications using live view, very similar to what you would do in the JavaScript world with Electron. But I think it's important for Elixir to span the whole developer experience to some degree. So I think there's the gap still. definitely in the front end desktop application development, where right now you always have to swap to a different language, right? And then you bring in Kotlin or you bring in JavaScript or you bring some other language in, and there is a need to have that language just because Elixir isn't there yet. Like doing iOS development with Elixir or Android development with Elixir or macOS development with Elixir is really tough right now. So you're going to go to one of the other languages. But I think it doesn't have to be the best language there. But right now it's like a forcing function. If you have something in your company that needs to do any of this, you're forced to use a different language. So I think that's really a gap that I would like to fill. Apart from that, I think there's always this underlying like performance could be better. I think the VM has made tons of improvements over the last couple of years, but there's still space. I would really like to see not such a big gap from the Beam to like the Java VM in terms of pure number crunching performance. I think that would also help us in terms of getting rid of NIFs. Right now there's often a need to write a NIF in Rust. We were just talking about types. Like one of the things is actually evaluating types and checking, like running dialyzer, running the new type checkers. They're actually very slow. And so the teams are thinking, well, we can write some part of the type checker itself in Rust, so it's faster. So it would be really nice to get like the VM to a state where that is not necessary anymore.
One thing that would be good would be to choose one tool, at least for Erlang. Instead of having River 3, Erlang UK, and maybe other builders, just pick one of them, sanction them, and so everybody use that thing. Or maybe for the formatter, to have one formatter and everybody use the thing, including the Erlang OTP code base, so that when I, for instance, teach Erlang to the people, I don't have to go, this is one of the options, but then you have this one and this one and this one. And whenever you join a new company, the first thing you have to do is, how do you manage things in this company? It will be much better if it was all the same. You just join the project, you know that it's a River 3 maintained project with the formatter, with the code checker, everything, and that's it.
Well, there are always room for improvements. Beam still offers a great lower level stuff, maybe less of higher level abstractions. Some things are tricky to use, but they're possible, but tricky to use. So giving some higher level support for distributed programming, I think would be nice. There are like various attempts to do this, but somehow I feel that they are still not mature enough or maybe feature rich enough. So those kind of things mostly come to mind.
I think if you asked me this question like maybe a year ago or something, I would say that in some specific circumstances you need absolute best performance. And so that then would be something that we would maybe miss on the Beam. But I think over the last year or maybe like even 2 years, with the focus on the ML space, we have shown that we can have very efficient data processing things in Elixir. I mean, the underlying stuff is written somewhere else, but we can leverage that in Elixir. So yeah, I don't know off the top of my head what I'm missing.
One thing that we think about and then that I think about a lot is kind of scaling the development experience. So Erlang comes generally from relatively small teams working on relatively small projects. So thinking what other tools you need, what other properties of the runtime and then surrounding things you need to scale that to large team working on big code bases and an extremely fast iteration of changes is something that kind of concerns me in particular. I really look forward to some of the changes that have been announced by the OTP team, like improving test coverage, improving things that we also internally work on improving dialyzer and the performance of it. Since even though we have equalizer in our type checker, we still do run dialyzer. So they have slightly different approaches to how they do things. And then kind of just trying to get performance there. And in general, I think some kind of high-level review of the tools that we do have and how they work. And then perhaps whether we have done some things that are half-finished, should we kind of push them all the way through or maybe kind of abandon them in favor of something else? So kind of considering those things like backwards compatibility versus new features versus things like that, I think it's where the community needs to go.
The type system in Elixir is something that really, really intrigues me because I think it can really help. I use Dialyzer in all of my open source projects, but it's just not great in my opinion. Especially if you think about working in a big company, its error messages are so obtuse. There's so many things that it does not catch. That's one thing that I really wish we would have. And then the other thing that's on the completely other side, I just have a passing interest in game development. And of course, Elixir will probably never be the language to run 3D computer games in, but like for the server that we make that better. And I found it quite interesting because I was looking into Godot, which is a great open source game engine. And there's both like a very popular guy that does Godot, and he also loves Elixir. And then there's also another Twitter account that is not run by him that also does Godot, that also loves Elixir. So if we could bring the two of them together, and so for maybe multiplayer games, we make an easy integration or like a Godot adapter for Phoenix channels. So to make that work more fluently, I think that might be cool. And we could see Elixir being used as sort of like the server part component, maybe in some multiplayer games. I know normally they do UDP, but I think for some games you can probably get away with WebSockets.
I'm kind of in a privileged position in the sense that, at least for Elixir, if I want to add something to Elixir, I have the mechanisms to make that work. Of course, all the large changes that we do, we take feedback from the community. And there are things that I would like to add. So for example, I always feel like comprehensions, like for comprehensions in Elixir can be more expressive, but I don't know how to do that. It's an open problem that I don't know how to solve it. So there are things that I want to do and I don't, because I don't know how to do that elegantly. But if there's something that I want to do and I feel like, oh, I kind of know a way forward, I start exploring it, I present it to the community. And if it makes sense, we make it part of the language. But if not, we build it as part of the ecosystem. And with the Beam, I think it has been quite similar, because the Erlang OTP team has always been very welcoming and receptive to ideas. And, when I think there is something that it can be important for Elixir and it's also valuable for Erlang, I present those ideas. And if they think it makes sense, I am contributing to Erlang OTP also whenever I can. And it's always a fun time.
One thing that I see, which I think we have to improve, is the community of Elixir. It is very heavy on senior developers. It is not that welcoming to junior developers and beginners that have never written before. Because I come from the Python community, where there are many community-driven events which are affordable for people to attend. They also have a different vibe around them. They're less professional. Somebody who picked up the language 3 months ago can give a talk about their experience, about how it was for them to start with the language. And then the community as a whole can learn from these talks, how we can make it even easier for people to onboard. And I miss it a little bit in the Elixir community. And you see that how it started was we going to extend Erlang. We're going to bring experienced Rubyists into the community who can understand why Elixir is a better choice than Ruby. It's a great adoption method. But I think now we're at the point where we have to really reach into the untapped potential, which is people who are not senior, who are more junior, meteor, beginners. And I think that as a community, we have to ease the way into it with education, with material, with courses, with conferences, all of these kind of things.